Hello, girls. We're here to finish the nervous system. We are mostly going to review a couple things and introduce a couple things, just some last items, and then take the second part of nervous system test on Tuesday to be done with it. So this is one thing I wanted to review. If you recall, this is the receiving neuron. These dark orange and green neurons are the sending neurons. So they're going to be the ones sending or transmitting their message, their nerve impulse. And there's two different types. In this diagram, the green means excitatory, which probably an easier word to understand is stimulating, because they stimulate this neuron. And the rust-colored ones are inhibitory. In other words, inhibiting or preventing the sending of a nerve impulse into this receiving neuron. So that's the concept, is that these are stimulating, these are inhibiting. I gave a kind of colorful example last time about that concept, right? Of some things that make you cry and some things that you're trying to hold back your tears would be like the stimulation is the making you cry. The stimulating would be the inhibition would be holding back your tears. If this was a neuron for your tear ducts. So that's the concept. But to understand what's happening chemically, I wanted to look again at this. So if the green ones are stimulating, what the green ones are doing is best understood by looking at the action potential. Here is a nerve at rest. When an action potential begins, what happens? Sodium ions enter and the charges are reversed. Sodium ion entering is what stimulates an action potential, right? And as it travels down along, sodium ions entering. So look what happens with a green or stimulating or excitatory neuron. Oh dear. I don't have it here. Oh, here it is. Sorry, it's on this very slide. Excitatory or stimulating neurons open up sodium channels. Because when you open a sodium channel, as we just saw in that diagram a moment ago, it transmits the action potential. It transmits the nerve impulse. Okay? So that makes sense. Now, what about the inhibitory ones, the rust-colored ones? They are not going to open up sodium gates, obviously, because that would stimulate an action potential. So think about it this way. If reversing the charge is what stimulates, making the inside positive, guess what an inhibitory one will do? It will make the inside more negative. So it's even less likely to be stimulated. And that's exactly right. The inhibitory ones, inhibitory neurons and neurotransmitters open up negative ion channels, often chlorine ion channels. And by opening up chlorine ion channels, they make the nerve cell more negative and make it even less able to receive an action potential. Make it more difficult for an action potential to be initiated. Don't worry about the double parentheses, that's too complicated, so skip that. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So you can understand both conceptually and chemically what's happening with the stimulating and with an inhibitory neuron. Okay, next thing I wanted to review. If you remember, when a neurotransmitter is in the synapse, it's stimulating the receiving cell, right? And that stimulation would continue, and that nerve cell would keep firing and firing and firing, right? Keep being stimulated nonstop if something doesn't stop it. So how does the neurotransmitter stop? How does neural stimulation stop? Two ways. The neurotransmitter can disintegrate, or very often, the neurotransmitter goes through what's called reuptake. That's just a fancy name for the sending neuron to regather or reuptake the neurotransmitter. And it's going to store it in its axon terminal for the next time. So let's look at what that looks like. Here we are. Here's the sending neuron. Here's the receiving neuron. This picture reminds us what's happening here. The axon terminal and the dendrite of a new neuron. But in any case, this neurotransmitter, the little triangles here, are stimulating the receiving neuron, and they're making an impulse happen, and they would keep stimulating it. And that impulse would keep occurring again and again and again. But there's something which stops it. There's this reuptake protein. and it gathers up the neurotransmitter, and it's going to store the neurotransmitter for next time. And so it stops the transmission of the nerve impulse, which is a good thing, because if your nerve impulses fired nonstop, it would be incoherent. The same thing would keep happening over and over and over again, meaninglessly. So the reuptake is really important. And you'll see it becomes even more important in a few minutes, the next thing we're going to do. All right, I'm going to skip down quite a bit to, here we are. This is pretty simple. It's just a couple of definitions. The meninges are the membranes which externally surround the brain and the spinal cord. So you can imagine it's kind of an awkward shape. It's a membrane which surrounds your entire brain and then extends down in one big continuous piece that extends down your spinal cord. Within it, inside of these membranes, is fluid. So they're sealed tight. And the fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid because it surrounds your cerebral, your spine. You've probably heard of meningitis. You've probably heard of it as something pretty serious because it is. It's an inflammation or an infection of the meninges. And it messes around with your cerebrospinal fluid and causes a lot of problems. That's why it's seen as something serious. So that's sort of a parenthetical remark. So what about this cerebrospinal fluid? It's often called CSF. It's just this clear, colorless liquid. It surrounds and protects the CNS, the brain and the spinal cord. It contains all the dissolved things, which are dissolved also in blood and interstitial fluid. Oxygen, CO2, nutrients, ions, etc., etc. And because of that, it allows for gas exchange, in other words, CO2, O2 exchange, for nutrient waste exchange, for your CNS. So your brain and your spinal cord receive nutrients and get rid of their waste through the cerebrospinal fluid. And it really plays the same role as interstitial fluid does for other cells. So it more or less nourishes the brain. This light blue stuff is the cerebrospinal fluid. And strangely enough, we'll talk about it in a moment, the blue stuff is also, it has these particular openings that it flows through. And it flows down here. We can't see the rest of the spinal cord, but it flows down around your spinal cord as well. There's one other function it has. It's really easy. It cushions the brain. The fluid absorbs impact. So it's a little bit of a shock absorber to protect your brain for when your head gets hit. Okay. Oh, this is just to show, this picture is not so great, but it's just to show that it's circulating, it's flowing. If you see those little black arrows all over the place, it's circulating and flowing around, circulating down. And that's important because every time it has to nourish the brain with oxygen and get rid of its CO2, but that means it has to be continuously changed. And the pressure of this fluid is very precise. And if something goes wrong with your meninges, it can mess up the pressure on the brain and cause brain damage and so on. Cause a lot of different problems. Some temporary, some not. Okay, the next thing I want to look at, the very last thing, and this is sort of an unusual topic, but we can add it on here because it's really interesting, and I found it in a page of the textbook. Dopamine is a very specific neurotransmitter. It's a neurotransmitter that functions in transmitting pleasure and satisfaction. Actually, in psychological books, they call it the reward system. I don't know why exactly, but it has to do with pleasure and satisfaction most of the time. So if this is dopamine, this receiving neuron would be a neuron somehow affecting pleasure or mood or satisfaction. And dopamine is stimulating it, so it's stimulating pleasure. Many addictive drugs affect dopamine in a really unusual way. So let's look at how this happens. Okay, this picture is kind of blurry, but in this picture, this is a neuron for pleasure, the receiving neuron. The orange stuff is dopamine, and this is food, because when we're eating tasty food, what happens? It gives us pleasure. So dopamine is connecting and sending the nerve impulse that's stimulating pleasure and satisfaction. Okay, look what's happening with cocaine. We're going to close in on it. Let me just look at one last thing, sorry. In this left side of the picture, the dopamine is taken back into the sending cell, sending neuron, by reuptake, right? And it can happen here too. So dopamine comes out, stimulates pleasure, and then gets taken back in, which means the pleasure signal is only temporary. And that makes sense. If you eat a brownie, it gives you temporary pleasure. It doesn't give you pleasure for hours on end. So this is what the normal stimulation of pleasure, and food is just an example, how it occurs. So now let's, oops, sorry, I took another slide actually. I thought I'd taken this one. Let me just give you a quick preview. The red is the effect of cocaine. It is blocking the reuptake. See where these reuptakes were occurring? The red is blocking reuptake. Dopamine is not taken back into the sending cell. So what happens? The synapse is flooded with dopamine. There's an incredible excessive amount of dopamine, and the nerve impulse continues to be stimulated nonstop. So this picture shows the same thing, just somewhat different. Here the dopamine is red. Here they're using the example of cocaine. It happens with many addictive drugs, not just cocaine. The white cocaine, over here, this is the reuptake protein. They're calling it dopamine transporter, but it's reuptake. It's being blocked by the cocaine. So the dopamine cannot be taken up. So the dopamine floods the synapse, and continual stimulation, nonstop stimulation of this nerve, which is a pleasure nerve. And so it's an artificial stimulation of pleasure. It's what is known as the high, right? Drugs that produce a high, which many drugs do to one extent or another. NT stands for neurotransmitter, right? Okay, so now look at what the effect of these drugs are. This is what's really crazy. Take your time with this slide. It's kind of confusing. Let's do first the text and then the pictures. When the brain realizes that there is excessive dopamine stimulation, like all parts of your body's always adjusting things. Your brain adjusts. Your brain says there's abnormal dopamine stimulation, so your brain gets rid of dopamine receptors. And therefore, it eliminates your ability to receive natural pleasure. This is what being addicted does to you. It takes away your ability for a natural experience of pleasure because you have very few dopamine receptors. Many addictive drugs affect dopamine. It's also true for alcohol addiction. Apparently, food addiction can do this to some extent also. So now let's look at the pictures. These pictures represent the quantity of dopamine receptors. They're called D2 receptors, dopamine receptors. Red is really high quantity. Yellow is pretty high. Green is quite high. Blue is super low. These are brain scans, okay? These represent an addicted brain, all on the right, and a control, a comparatively normal brain. They probably tried to find someone of a similar age and similar gender and similar health, whatever. So here's a person on cocaine. See the presence of red, high concentrations of dopamine, and here, very little, no red at all, much less yellow, and so on. So you see how these different drugs all have a big impact. The alcoholic still has a little bit of red, but much less than in the previous one. The heroin addict, again, has no red, so no high concentrations of dopamine. So think about the consequences of this. The person who's an addict has, number one, made it such that they need to increase their drug doses to receive the pleasure they once received because they don't have the dopamine to receive that pleasure, the dopamine receptors to receive that pleasure. And number two, they've made it hard for themselves to receive normal, natural pleasure, the pleasure you get from eating tasty food, from seeing the sunshine, from seeing a friend. They've made that pleasure really difficult for themselves to receive because they have so few dopamine receptors. So what do? They get more and more depressed and fall apart and need drugs more. So this is a really interesting scientific understanding of what addiction really is. And you understand it because you know what reuptake is. So in a nutshell, drugs inhibit the reuptake of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And as a result, your brain adjusts by getting rid of dopamine receptors. Okay, that's it. Take care, girls.